of Learning at M+, and it is my great pleasure to welcome you all to the grand stair this evening as we launch Prada Frames. Prada Frames was conceived by Andrea Tremacchi and Simone Ferrazin of the Italian design studio Formafantasma. It is a yearly symposium that investigates the complex and nuanced relationship between the environment, art, and design. This year's theme is Materials in Flux. The theme investigates the dynamics that govern waste infrastructures and their value systems, aiming to unpack the complex relationship between matter and ecosystems. I believe sincerely that the idea of the museum is a forum, that it is a place of dialogue and exchange, which is why we are thrilled to be co-curating this edition. My thanks to my co-curator, Ikko, Yokoyama, and the sensational support team of M+, and to Prada for making this event possible. Today, Prada Frames at M+ launches with a lecture by Jacques Herzog. Tomorrow, we will host 2 panels that bring together architects, artists, designers, and thinkers to focus on the global ambition of sustainability from their practices and places. The first one, Sea States, tackles the role of the ocean in climate change. The second panel, Reconceiving Material Circulation, examines how waste becomes part of the circulation of goods across economies, geographies, and the human experience. M+ opened to the public in November 2021. Due to the pandemic, we were unable to welcome our museum architects, Herzog de Meuron, to join us for the opening celebrations. So tonight is particularly special as we welcome Jacques Herzog to reflect on building M+ and the role of architecture in civil society. Before I turn the panel over to Suhanya to introduce Jacques, I'd just like to point out a few house rules that I want you all to be aware of. So please make sure no eating and drinking take place in the grand stair, no video or audio recording, photo taking is fine, just no flash photography, and please make sure to switch off any mobile devices. Finally, we will have a few chances for questions at the end. We're using a mobile app for you to ask your questions. The QR code is on the postcard that was on your chair. So if you want to ask questions, simply input them through the QR code at any time during the session, and the panel will have a conversation with Jacques at the end and raise some of your questions. I'd now like very much to invite M+ director Suhanya Raffel to introduce Jacques Herzog.
Welcome. I think I can hear some Australians in our audience there. But actually more than Australians, the world is here. And we are so happy to welcome you to M+ and to our Art Week. It's phenomenal for us to be at this moment to celebrate something really important for the museum world, but also for cultural world. And we're so honored to have our architects, and the studio is here, the entire team. So it is really a delight to welcome Jacques Herzog, who is, of course, founding partner of Herzog de Meuron, and one of the key architects of this project. He really doesn't need much introduction, but Herzog de Meuron is led by the 2 founders, Jacques Herzog and Keri de Meuron, together with the current partners and CEO. The practice was established in Basel in 1978, and today an international team of over 600 collaborators are engaged in a wide range of projects across Europe, the Americas, and Asia. The main office in Basel works in tandem with studios in Berlin and Munich, Paris, London, Hong Kong, New York, San Francisco, and with site offices in Copenhagen and Jerusalem. A truly global firm. Herzog de Meuron has received awards including the Pritzker Architecture Prize in 2001, the Riba Royal Gold Medal in 2007, the Premium Imperiale 2007, and the Mies Crown Hall America's Prize 2014. 10 years ago, Herzog and de Meuron was selected to design in Plus. What a visionary decision that was. And finally, this weekend, yesterday, we were able to welcome all of the partners from Basel to see the completion of this museum from their eyes. Of course, it is filled with art, programs, and audiences. Just yesterday, we had what is our second opening for our international guests, and we had an amazing party to celebrate. It has been an extraordinary journey that we have all gone through together, many of us, to deliver this one-of-a-kind and truly 21st century museum of visual culture. And it was our privilege to work with the founding partners, Jacques and Pierre, as well as senior partner Askan Mergenthaler, partner Wim Walschap, studio director Hong Kong Edmund Choi, and their teams. A truly collaborative project to make M+ happen. I think we have welcomed over, just coming up to 3 million visitors to the museum since we opened in November 2021. And I think it's when the people occupy this building that you really understand the genius of design. And the design that is almost a magic that happens. I don't know that it happens in the design process. Maybe it is the many minds that worked together to think through and make this such a creative project. But it is almost intangible, the beauty of what cultural institutions mean in society. And as we opened during a pandemic, the institution became a place of respite, a place of reflection, as much as a place of celebration. So we have had our first celebration in terms of the International Week now, and I'm thrilled that Jacques is here and agreed to give this lecture when this house is as we had imagined it to be, with audiences both from Hong Kong and beyond. Also, I must express my sincere thanks to Prada, who invited us to co-host Asia's premiere of Prada Frames, and the team's excellent execution and thoughtful collaboration. The event brings up urgent issues of sustainability and demonstrates how the museum can be the container for this stimulation, for this discussion, for what is actually a very serious and important conversation around environment, art, architecture, and design. After Jacques' lecture, I will come back together with Ikko Yokoyama, our lead curator of design and architecture, to have a further conversation with him. So without further ado, I invite Jacques to come on stage.
Good evening. Thank you for coming and for listening to Found. Found is the title of that presentation, that lecture, as I call it, at, around, and for M+, here in Hong Kong. Found is the name of that lecture because I would like to put it in the foreground and present some projects around that word, that term, from very early beginnings to much later projects. All of those projects are very different, but have something that connects them, like a kind of a hidden underground that connects these different projects. Found is also a term that in those early years we didn't use consciously, but unconsciously we're looking for something that could be our approach. In '79, just a year after we started our office, Pierre and myself, without employees, without partners at that time. Later, yes, many projects I present here, yes, of course, with partners and teams. But in those early days, in the '70s, that was a time with beginning postmodernism, with deconstructivism, all things that we didn't like at all. We hated, and we needed to find our own approach to what architecture could be, to create a kind of a path on which we could enter this world of architecture. And so we started also doing competitions, and the first competition that, maybe not the very first, but one of the first was Marktplatz in Basel. That is a project that we did in '79, and we surprisingly won that competition as totally unknown young team, and reworked the project several times, but it was never realized. The Marktplatz is a public square in the center of Basel, in the inner city, in the historic city. As the name says, features market stands almost daily. And in those years, in the '70s, as it was a trend, there was a trend to unnecessarily decorated public squares with chandeliers, with benches, with all kinds of pavilion and, as I said, unnecessary stuff. And we, being pupils of Aldo Rossi, who has trained us in learning from the city, from the historic city, were looking into what is around us. And this fragment here shows you, anyway, maybe in addition to what I said about found, finding something is a strategy, which is based on looking, based on perceiving, based on looking in a creative way, in a way that discovers something, and in fact is an artistic practice that wasn't very common in architecture. Finding is related to the here and now, and to discover something that allows you as a creator, as an architect, or as an artist to use what is there, what is in a given context, in a given ground. And especially when it comes to architecture, you can understand that when someone says, well, this architecture is made for this or that place, many people say that, but very rarely this is the case, because many things are very ubiquitous. And finding means that you identify given structures around or in the ground, as we will see, that literally make a piece, an architectural piece, specific for a place. The term of specificity, which we also introduced at that time, is tightly connected to the term of found. The market square, as you can see here, is in the center of Basel, and when you look at the center, is a typically medieval city center, which has these strangely, seemingly organic forms, which is not because a designer has designed it accordingly, but because people were forced into this form, into this shape, which of course is a result of a former river that was flowing there, as you could see on the plan that we found in the archives and redesigned, where you can see that till the early 20th century, part of that river were still openly flowing through the city. In the very old times, that river was used as a kind of a cloac where people would throw everything in. So necessarily they covered it in the course of the centuries. Especially also in that part of the marketplace, this river was tunneled and was hidden away in the consciousness and awareness of people. But we found something interesting in that very river. So instead of designing something, we went to discover, we went down in that tunnel. Some of it can be seen here, that was built in various fragments in the course of the centuries. Much of that tunnel is still a medieval structure. You can see here Pierre and myself in that tunnel around the year 1979. Quite a funny picture. The plan we did, the first one was just a fountain that, as you can see in the center, was having a kind of a waterfall, so the water was being pumped up into the fountain and would go down onto the river. So it was just a kind of reminding people of the existence of that river. Later we reworked the project and made it even more discreet. We saw these rosettes of pavers from the 19th century, and we found it very interesting to take one of those, the central one, and punch a hole in that surface, to take away some pavers and create a kind of a space like an ear connecting the surface of the square with the tunneled river underground, and would use that in-between space as a kind of an acoustic sculpture, so that passers-by would hear the noise of the hidden river as a kind of a sculpture for those who would be interested in that hidden piece of nature. That was like a very early example of different attitude towards architecture, towards the city, and towards the current trends in architecture, against decoration, against furnishing the public space. Not much later, 3 years later, we were commissioned to do a house in Italy, near the coast in Liguria, the Mediterranean coast, not far away. In that landscape that, as you can see, almost doesn't have any buildings. It's almost like jungle, because it is a kind of a abandoned agricultural site with lots of ruins of former stables or abandoned olive and wine groves. We found that very interesting because the material to do something was lying around, was literally to be found and collected, gathered, piled up to create a new building. As a form, we did not really want to do a form. We very often do not want to do a form, but to find a form, we said we take this Cartesian grid, a kind of a Solowitian structure, this cross which is dividing into 4 pieces, or you could also say 4 pieces are coming together to form a whole. So it's also a kind of almost philosophical question. Is it a division or is it a sum of different forms? Anyway, it doesn't have corridors. It doesn't have serving spaces. It just has spaces which are identities in themselves and together make for the building. This is the naked structure, the pure structure, which we then filled in with the before mentioned stones that we collected, and we piled them up and filled them into this Cartesian grid without mortar. We wanted even the stones not to be altered. We wanted to just shelve them like you shelve books into a bookshelf. This produced a rather beautiful structure that was very successful with the architectural media, so that was a very important step for ourselves to be seen as young architects. Mainly it has one floor with these 4 rooms, and above it has an attic with views across the landscape that I presented before. And astonishing that the building is still there and is still being used as a private house. Much later, actually, Ricola, with whom we collaborated over many years, was offering us a new project. We've done certainly about 5 or 6 buildings with them. And since they are amazing clients, because they trusted us and they came back many times, we became also friendly with them, very much so, and we knew that doing a project for them, a herb factory, a herb center, a building where producing dried herbs and store up dried herbs for their products would be interesting in the context of the landscape, in the context of new construction methods, new technologies that would benefit both the client because it's making their product more natural, it enhances their original brand and also their ambition, and on the other side it helps us to continue our experimental path with materials, with giving materials, matter, a serious role, not just a decorative role. A serious role in that the landscape, again, where we do the building, in not far from Basel, southwest of Basel, in the Jura Mountains, as you could see on that quarry. The Jura Mountains is a parallel mountain chain to the Alps. The 2 mountain chains, the Alps and the Jura, are basically defining the shape of Switzerland. And the Jura Mountains, as you can see in that image, is basically geologically shaped by limestone, clay, loess, fantastic materials to produce ceramics. And you all may have heard of Laufen, the brand name for a company which is producing state-of-the-art porcelain for sanitary objects worldwide. The building that you see in the middle of the image can hardly be seen. Why? Because the material we use is from that very ground, is earth, is kind of earth and clay in a very interesting combination, which is reflecting, of course, the color the landscape itself has when you look at it from a certain distance. From closer, you can see that what we've done resulted in a very simple structure, has an almost archaic expression and a certain elegance, even if it's so elementary, I would say, in how we did it. You can see on a few images, the process in itself was very interesting because we were looking for an existing storage building nearby where all the materials could come in, all the ingredients, like for cooking, gravels and pebbles of different sizes, and where we could mix together those products. We were working together with Martin Rauch, who is the best expert worldwide to produce earth walls of all kinds, all kind of technologies. And we also developed something especially for this building, in that we didn't pour those walls, we didn't press it, but we did a kind of prefabrication with slabs in those storage buildings that would later be manually operated and prepared for the site, the construction site, where they would be piled up like a kind of a huge masonry, where then the joints would be filled with earth again to make this very smooth, wonderfully haptic, very, very nice tactile surface. Everybody who goes visit the building wants to touch the building. It's like a material you could almost eat. Also from inside, of course, it's the same material. It has a very interesting permeability, but also a very great stability. It's a great material, great inertia to keep the material, the products, in a stable climatic condition. Outside, as I showed before on another slide, the building is quite elegant. You see those horizontal lines, which are very thin cement lines, which are introduced in order to prevent the wall from rapid erosion. So they are like barriers. And at the same time, they lend the building a kind of a horizontal topography, which is remindful almost of old Italian palazzo. The Schaulager, also a project which came later, but now is more than 25 years ago that we could do this super important building for our career demonstration from the client, Maya Öri, who invented that typology that was radically new then in the art world. A show storage which combines, which is a kind of a hybrid between a museum with a public face and a storage with an unpublic space, which is very opaque, almost hidden away. And I think this image expresses this double function quite a bit. A show storage is made in order to present works of art openly, not in crates, like in all other museums at that time. In crates where you cannot control how artworks behave when you don't look at them, where it can degrade and can be damaged. And the interesting thing is to present them openly, but in a more condensed way, is that you don't need to build so much expansion, unnecessary museum expansions all over the world, but you can compress it, condense it more, and can nevertheless leave the building open for scholars and other visitors which are asking for getting admission, which is very often the case, and which works very well over the years. You can also see that in that wall, which we will speak about a bit later, that the solidity and the permanence, the inertia, the stability of the walls of the whole building is key to reach the goals of a show storage, where these very valuable, very precious artworks are being stored away, very fragile artworks. So the building necessarily has few windows, doesn't have much daylight, just the necessary daylight for people working there, researchers, etc. And of course, the public face as you come in, which allows people to get an overview. Where am I? Where is the artwork I want to see? It has some semi-permanent art installations, it has some, occasionally it has exhibitions, and in the upper floors, in this condensed way that I described before, it has a kind of cells for each artist or each artwork, where artworks are presented like in the museum, like they are to be seen, but much closer. So you would not need to expand, as I said, unnecessarily museums. In that case here, unlike the Ricola building, where the material came from a quarry nearby, as we dug a hole in the Schaulager site, the Schaulager is at the southern periphery of Basel, you dig a hole and you find this unbelievable deposit of gravel and pebbles that the Rhine River was bringing there in the course of millions of years. That's super valuable treasure, almost hidden in the earth. And in that respect, the Schaulager could be a demonstration or an ideal example of how we could build in the future. In the future, an ideal construction is wherever you build a building, wherever, even on the moon, you can dig a hole, and what you dig out can be used to do the building. In that case, really that's what happened. We dug out the ground and took the gravel and the pebbles away, piled it up, and did the concrete for the entire construction out of this material. Originally, we wanted to do earth walls, but the building was too high and it was too dangerous to just use earth without cement. So it is a kind of a concrete, but the material, all the heavy loads that normally will be brought onto a construction site from far away with tons of camions and lorries could be saved. Later, the concrete walls, the pebbles, were brought to the fore again by manual manipulation of the surface, which then brought to the fore the original quality, the original also beauty and size of the material that we used for this building. Quite later, another project where we could work with the underground in a, again, different way is the Serpentine Pavilion, a project we did in collaboration with our artist friend Ai Weiwei. We also dug out the ground, but in contrast to the Schaulager, we didn't use the material that we dug out. We were looking for something different. We were looking for what was left from the previous pavilions. We knew that, I think, 11 architects had done a pavilion before, all of which somehow interesting, with their own beauty or their own narrative, their own whatever history. And again, without inventing something, we were trying to find something. And of course, finding something is more easily said than done. But here, the idea was to find traces of previous pavilions, and we overlaid them, as you can see on some of these sketches. We overlaid them and created a very complex mixture of traces of the foundations of previous pavilions. Some of those foundations were still physically in the ground, but we were more interested in the theory, in the virtual rests of those pavilions that we overlaid, and in the intersection of those overlaid plans we could identify connections that we then extruded and created very strange freaks, sculptural freaks that would make for the shape of columns and create a landscape that were of steps and benches that people could use like in a kind of a fantasy garden, with areas where you could walk through, with areas which were more intimate and some were more public. As you know, the pavilion is always used for public discussions, for presentations, to just hang around, to meet friends. And we used cork to cover those traces that were left in the ground or that we discovered in the ground. And cork is a material that is nice because it's very beautiful. It feels very good when you touch it, quite warm. And it can be reused. It can be reassembled and be reused in a different place. All elements that are increasingly important. And nevertheless created a very specific, very unique atmosphere. As you can see here, we also developed this corker, this kind of stool that you can still find on our website as a leftover of this pavilion. As I said, I think it worked very well. It was very successful in its few months that existed in the summer 2011, I think, or 2012 in London. We covered it with this simple thin roof, literally a thin roof, a thin layer of water which would reflect the sky and offer an interesting pool for the birds who used it very frequently. I quite like this image because it reflects the sky, it also reflects the trees. It has something very ephemeral, very detached from the earth, and in contrast to the cork landscape, to the unearthed traces we found in the ground. An image which is in a kind of a special way also remindful of what we have here at M+, as we will see. We also have this kind of figure of the earth and the sky together, like something, a figure, a human figure which is opening up. I cannot speak about all these things that we found without talking about Tate Modern. And Tate Modern in itself, the fact that Tate Modern exists, was discovered as a site by Nicholas Sirota, already in itself is a super example of finding something, because to identify this totally hidden away castle in the south of London was very important. Nobody actually knew this site, and especially it was totally, I wouldn't say abandoned, it was never really in use, it was never really a part of the city. I like this image because it juxtaposes the tower of Tate Modern with the dome of St. Paul's, the still today most important building in London, most beautiful building in London. A monumental building that the architect, Sir Giles Scott of Bankside Power Station, was very consciously positioning against each other. So that's an example of finding. But of course, we were very consciously continuing this narrative in that this juxtaposition was continued in how we developed the project with the light beam above across St. Paul's Cathedral. This image of the opening of the Bankside Power Station in the early 60s also highlights the importance of that tower as a symbol of an industrial world in London in a, I would almost say, pre-modern time, even if it was already post-war. But indeed, if you look at how the building was constructed in the late 50s, you can see that this building is really heavily anchoring itself in the ground, in the southern shore of the River Thames. And why? Because the boats had to bring the oil to fuel the Bankside power station, which was going to produce electricity for decades in London, brings together earth and water. And it heavily anchors itself deep into the ground of that site. Please look also around the Bankside power station. That is about only 60 years ago, when now this whole site, as a result of the success of Tate Modern, is surrounded by an ugly ocean of high-rises, of towers, all as a result of this radical transformation of this site. That's how we found Tate Modern, Bankside Power Station, when we all visited the building, all competitors for the competition. And we immediately saw, again, the intention of the architect with this big window in the back. You can see easily the context or the kind of association to basilica, to church, to cathedral, to something public, something important. And we wanted to further tell that story, to enhance that narrative, make that turbine hall into a real tall public space, make the unpublic the most public space at all in London. And so we dug out the entire turbine hall to the lowest point that you saw before on that early image when Bankside Power Station was constructed. We literally take away every part that down to the foundations, inside and outside, so we could bring in the ramp into Tate Modern, so that finally the Queen in the middle could open it in the year 2000. And this image is funny because it shows the Queen walking down and opening Tate Modern in the year 2000, the same Queen who in the early 60s was opening Bankside Power Station as a power station. You can also see in that image, I mean, you all may have been at Tate Modern, that it really works as a public space. It became certainly the most visited public space in London, certainly inside the museum, and also the Olafur Eliasson installation on the right-hand side, maybe on the left-hand side from you, no, on the right-hand side, is one of the successful art installations which were made possible with the creation of that space, that as a space in that dimension has not been available before for contemporary artists. But after having opened that building, we continued. We knew that there was more. We knew that there were these oil tanks in the ground that had a huge potential to offer unexpected and unlikely spaces, unlikely gallery spaces for contemporary art, but also for even traditional art. You can also show paintings in these impossible conditions that, of course, have become now familiar to everybody, but were not at all 20 years ago. And these spaces were then, of course, adopted by artists for video installations, for performance art, for projections, for all kinds of also acoustic sculptures, music, etc., and public gatherings. On that image, you can see that the existing structures of the oil tanks, these existing raw concrete structures, were added by our own structure, those inclined pillars, which were the foundations. The tanks were the foundations from where the new building shoots up towards the sky, shoots up like this spiraling stair from those underground spaces, those oil tanks, which are now the roots of Tate Modern, into the tower, which hosts public spaces for members, for children, for education, etc., etc. till it shows its exterior cladding, which lends the same physical expression from the existing building, this brick cladding, which brings these two buildings together, both of which are rooted deeply in the London Underground. Finally, M+, I think, would not have been possible without this whole history, this whole narrative, even if there was not and never a conscious reference or relationship when we worked on this project. And the competition, indeed, that we were offered and invited to do described the tunnel that runs through the site as a kind of hindering the project, and everybody would need to be careful to somehow not stumble over it. And literally, we wanted to stumble over it. And these three images describe a little bit the transformation of that part of Kowloon, in that it's reclaimed land, as we can see. It's built with material that comes from the construction of many towers in Hong Kong. So it's literally the material from the buildings, from the excavation, was deposited there and built a kind of an island. And that tunnel that you can see was in fact, of course, like a kind of a body of a huge animal that we wanted to discover. We didn't want to hide it. We wanted to bring it to the fore because it was there, and you cannot live with a dead body in the ground without giving it a certain life, a certain presence, a certain importance, especially since a tunnel, a train tunnel, is so much Hong Kong, this kind of element of dynamics, of expression of vitality, of speed. The proximity of the train, of the airport and Hong Kong was too seductive not to be used. And it's also interesting, as this slide shows, that we adopted the Cartesian order of the master plan and were very strict in this Cartesian order, very strict in this linearity, and accepted the dynamic and the diagonal organization of the tunnel as an element of surprise. So we didn't need to invent form, but we were given that form. We excavated the tunnel, but we covered it again with concrete. So we would create spaces that were raw. We didn't discover a space like in Tate, but we discovered an object and turned it into a space. So it's like a different sculptural method almost, but it's a similar mental or intellectual operation. I think this image is quite telling because it also reveals this kind of strange combination of something almost scary. It is like an abyss, but also something seductive. The plan reveals this kind of paradox or this kind of congestion, this kind of clash of geometries. The orthogonal one on the top, where you can see all these dark rectangles, which are like different buildings, even if it's cores of different activities, like in a city where you have cinemas, you have exhibition spaces, you have public spaces, you have restaurants, you have the auditorium, you have all these different functions that come together and welcome people as they come into the building. Unfortunately, it still doesn't have enough art, but that will change, as I have been told by Suhanya and her team. And you can see down into this abyss, onto installations and activities that normally you wouldn't have in a museum. And this kind of combination, this kind of in-depth look into the building as you come in is certainly one of the key things. We wanted this museum of the 21st century to have more than any other building, because this is a museum where visual arts, not just high art in the traditional sense, but all kinds of, literally spoken, diversity is being presented immediately when you come in. It's also very important, as I showed in the case of the Schaulage, as you come in, you see down, but you also see up. And the M+ is like a human figure. We excavate the ground, its roots in the ground, like a human figure. You stand on the feet. If you cannot stand on your feet in the morning and you start to stumble and you're not on your feet, you cannot really stand up and lift your head. And lift your head towards the sky in the vertical direction. That's what happens here. As you watch through this slit, you can see the slab that goes up above that abyss. That diagram reveals that more and also shows why the building is what it is. It has this kind of excavated underground, like a kind of contemporary archaeology, and then naturally, even a child would do this, you build a cover, like a roof. You just cover it, so logically it's horizontal. And horizontality is what you don't find in Hong Kong. Horizontality is a luxury somehow. So it's important to have that moment of tranquility, of calm, of something that covers, and covers really people and artworks. And this kind of cover, this kind of podium, as we called it then, is the place where more traditional galleries, this whole floor, are arranged. Galleries of a huge diversity, as we will see later, but this is the place of actually the collection and the exhibitions, where all the other parts are more public, are more unexpected, are more wild. And above, we have this slab that we will talk about a bit later again. Logically, when you have such a slab hovering, it has to be held in place. And that happens with these huge spans spanning across like a bridge above this archaeological site. And that's why these trusses are as they are. You could find them when you walk in the podium. You can see them. They express the strength, the forces that are required to span across that archaeological site. So that, again, is important because this kind of structural forces are expressed because it needs to have this kind of effort to cover this entire site. So that, again, this kind of architectural form is a logical and a wanted consequence. It's not a technical form. It's not high-tech architecture. It's to do immediately with this idea of something found. This area that you see is the foyer in that slab, in that hovering slab, around which then are arranged all the galleries that seem to be hovering effortless from outside, as effortless as the slab is erected above it. On that slide, you can see all the diversity, all the different galleries wrapping around. When you walk through the thick galleries, when you walk through the reconfigurable spaces to all other spaces, even the focus gallery under the slab, you could see how large, how big this museum is and how many, and that's very key, opportunities there are for curators and artists to develop their own thinking, to develop their own diverse concept of looking at the world, because that's ultimately what art is doing. That more traditional and very unconventional forms of art can be presented in different light conditions, like here with natural daylight from the top and here from the side with views, or more concentrated with opaque ceilings, different kinds of artificial light and different floor conditions, different wall conditions and views into courtyards. And even this bamboo gallery, which was conceived originally as the ink galleries, have a very more delicate, more intimate spatial quality. And breakout spaces with views, with benches to meet, to chat, to just hang around. And finally, the auditorium, the cinema where we sit now, is part of that slab, cutting through the slab, reaching the floor below. And I like also this gallery under the slab, the focus gallery, because the walls you see on both sides is part of this grid, this girder that you saw with the diagonals, which are expressing the shear forces. So these shear forces, structural forces, are part of the aesthetic of the gallery. And this focus gallery is right beneath, right below this slab, which sits on the podium, which, as you could see, perhaps yesterday evening, has really nice gardens that invite people to hang out, to meet, to talk, to hang around, to be together. The slab itself is very thin. I mentioned the podium is a very modernistic element, almost like the 1960s, horizontal as opposed to the vertical city, a paradox in Hong Kong, and enhances also the slab. So both work together very well. The slab is very thin, so it's very transparent, also very modernistic in its concept, like a skeleton, rather than a fat volume that surrounds this very slab. It works very well in itself during the day. It's quite beautiful because of this transparency, so it has a very uncommercial dimension. Developers would hate that kind of volume because they couldn't have enough program in it. But it's in fact interesting, of course, for the bar, for the restaurant, for offices, but also you could bring art up there. Originally that was the plan, to have art also in the tower. Because why is a tower interesting in Hong Kong? Obviously because that's the city of millions of towers. And interestingly, in Hong Kong, everybody can live in the tower. It's not privileged people. You can also have, and that we've visited artist studios in towers. That was very surprising to see, graphic designers, photographers, fashion labels in towers. And that was one motivation for us to develop, to conceive a tower for M+. It was also, of course, interesting to conceive a tower for M+, which is more than a tower. It's also a screen, because the LED technology is inserted in those ceramic blades that run around the slab. You could see that immediately when the light is on, the physical condition of the slab vanishes, and it transforms itself in a kind of a screen. In a screen that is like a Trojan horse, as I like to call it, a Trojan horse in the commercial backdrop of Hong Kong. The commercial backdrop, this kind of thousands and millions of lights, and the M+ could not compete in size, but can compete in the message. The message is artistic. The message is not commercial. The message is like a pirate, sailing into the landscape of Hong Kong. And many artists in the meantime have conceived site-specific work for the M+. So videos are not ubiquitous commercial advertisements, but they are very poetic messages. I especially love this piece by Ellen Pao because it has this poetic, almost spiritual quality, and it expresses and enhances what I called the erected human figure. It's like the feet in the ground and the head above, towards the sky. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Jacques. So now there's Suhanya and I join the conversation.
Thank you so much. I know we don't have a huge amount of time, so I just want to begin by saying it's fabulous to hear the arc that you constructed for us around the term found, and thinking about archaeologies, and especially in a place like Hong Kong, which is under construction continually. We always see building sites as part of the urban environment of this city, and then to think of the whole of West Kowloon, which was sea for so long. You gave us a very beautiful photograph of 100 years ago, and to know that that harbor itself has become much less generous on one hand, but very generous in terms of providing housing for the city, industry for the city, but this thought of the MTR lines being what you found as being the basis of making architecture. So I just wanted to ask, when you always are invited to make a project, do you seek that kind of archaeology in your site?
No, actually, I personally don't seek, but you find them sometimes. But I think it's a paradox again. You cannot find something if you're not having this kind of openness and this open mind. But it's not that we feel obliged or we seek, like, because it can have something a bit forced or forceful in it. And those examples which I showed don't have this kind of forcefulness. They are rather relaxed. And I could also, have presented projects where we had to invent everything, But you try, I think, as an artist also, you try to avoid form if it's not necessary. Because many, especially also in architecture, you can see works of architecture where you can see there is an effort of the architect to create, And I always somehow dislike this effort to create, So the effort to look before you do something is also, I think, ecologically more interesting. I mean, I don't want to abuse this term of ecology, but somehow much of what I showed has a kind of a character of ecology avant la lettre.
Yeah, totally. Because once you started the lecture, because I also wanted to ask, when you started the late 70s about postmodernism and deconstructionism, and you said you didn't like that, and then you already responded in the beginning of the lecture, and then also, so that was also very much the art, the context, but it's also very, as a young architect, and then also studied, but then how did you come to, what made you didn't like it, this kind of drawing and a surface? It's actually, more you open-minded, maybe it will lead to sometime these findings, maybe unsurprising results, and then also collaborative manner. That was pretty unusual in the 70s.
Yeah. I was personally more involved in art, and Pia and I then were in the art scene of local art scene. I was myself, I tried to work as an artist. I did also, but I then, understood that architecture would be more my tool to express myself. And as I said, we have grown up in Basel, which is very much a city of art, and so somehow that was tracing our way to some degree, you know. But I think it was more unconscious. I think to not like what surrounds you as a young person is quite common, you know. But the question is, how can you find out of this, and how can you find a way which is natural and which opens up a path? You can also dislike something, and then you're getting more and more complicated, and you get lost totally. It's not so easy to dislike things and to find your own path, but you have to do this. You know, and today I think it's again a very different situation. For people who begin now, it's again different, but to some degree you have to kill your ancestors to do something. And as you know, postmodernism and deconstructivism, they were recipes. That is a recipe, and this is, you know, leading in the disaster. You know, all the people who worked on that got stuck in their own idiosyncratic prison. You know, that's so it's you know, a sheer question of surviving. You know, that you do this. I mean, that's how I feel, at least.
Yeah, and also the ecological, the word you said, you didn't want to emphasize it, but in long run, from 70s to today, it's totally, you know, not been thinking about it, but it's also actually finding context, reusing, and also materiality. And then the way often the very significant your many project, in our case it's also tile, but it's a craftsmanship by you challenging them, quite a simple material, but you continue challenge the craftsman or artisan to make it simple, but something they never tried. That also leads to something preserving the materiality and the craftsmanship to the future, so which is also very, very amazing, I think.
Yeah, I think there's another aspect of ecology, which is being careful. I think whatever you do, you should do it with care. That's what we like so much about Asian culture. You know, I mean, Chinese and Japanese and also Korean traditions, art traditions, have that even more, let's say, at least at first sight. You know, carefulness and fragility are very amazing and surprising, I would say, aesthetic moments. And when you understand that and you go this way, then very logically you don't waste so much unnecessarily.
Just for audience to realize that when Ikko and you were talking about crafts, it's also referring in relation to, and plus our beautiful terracotta, the terracotta that clads so much of the museum, and with very distinct detail, and how you worked with studios in Italy to make this wonderful terracotta, which refers, as you say, back to architectural details here in China, the roof tiles and so on.
Yeah, the ceramic is, of course, a very important material in Chinese traditions, and paradoxically, the Italians were offering better quality for a better price. That's why we took the Italian ones. But you're not talking about ecology. This building is, I mean, radically concrete and ceramic. So from today's perspective, this is all forbidden. CO2-wise, this is a disaster. But you could not do a museum of that dimension in that urban condition above the kind of train tunnel, just doing it in bamboo or wood or something like that. And also given the kind of liability issues and all the preservation issues that are coming with artworks today, it would be impossible to do it without those materials. And again, I think when we talk about ecology and environmental issues in such a context, we have also to speak about the time we're talking about. I think it's different when you use those very precious and CO2, let's say, bound energy materials, if they are in such a long-term perspective as a museum is considered to be, it's a different thing, you know. When this building survives 100 years or even more, it's different than if you build an urban infrastructure and you take it down because you need to rebuild the highway and you change all the time, you destroy something. So the quality of the energy of transformation of architecture is a key question, you know, and the materials that we use should have that quality to sustain, you know, many generations.
I was also just going to ask what your reflections were in relation to the city of Hong Kong when you got this commission, because it's a very particular kind of city. It's a small city when you think about it in relation to population of Asian cities, 7.5 million, yet at the same time it's very dense, very vertical. And then thinking about making a very creative piece of architecture, I mean, it's very interesting that you made a emphatically horizontal piece of architecture in this vertical city. It feels like it's a response.
Well, as I said, I think the horizontality is a result of this kind of vertical search in the ground, and of course also this kind of horizon that the podium expresses is of course a contrast to the verticality of the city. So that's a wanted gesture. But also I think that we are lucky as architects that we were winning this competition, and at the same time we could do the police station transformation, Taikun, which is something we have another tradition, which is restoration, renovation, and transformation of buildings. I showed Tate Modern, but many other things we've done in the past. You know, the Caixa Forum in Madrid and the Stadtcasino in Basel, and many projects have that sense of transformation. And to do, I mean, if you visit Taikun, in the scale and the kind of approach of materials, and there are also the sequence of spaces and the accessibility from the street, the courtyards, is a totally different urban behavior. And it's important for a city to experience those totally different architectural typologies, you know. It has also a different role. It's more like a Kunsthalle versus a museum. But to have both things for an architect as a demonstration of what should a city, or can a city of that dimension offer to people, is of course fabulous. Even if we don't think that architects need to demonstrate skills or leave traces of their style. That's not what I want to say. What I want to say is that we want to offer diversity through our buildings.
And then responding to this, the context of this place, that I would like to take one question which disappeared, but I will remember. So it was a little bit about the ocean. So Tate was also in the waterfront, but was there any particular the thought about this site and this Empress building to the relation to the water?
Yes, the water in the sense that it is visible across the water. I think the screen that you see here in this project would be totally nonsense if you did it in London, even if it was also on the river. You know, it would be too big, it would be too overwhelming. This has a hard time struggling itself through these commercial signs, but that's why it is there. And the water is creating a gap, but it's not, let's say, you know, even if we all dream of having ferry boats or whatever to approach this site, like in a Böcklin painting, you know, when you approach the island of the death. Maybe one day this can be done, or it has a Venetian side to it.
Also almost against this kind of postmodernistic design, the language, there's among the many signs, and we make another unsigned, but in the same form. Also because we would like to have a lot of discussion, but it's also running out of time. So as you said, it's not about the postmodern was a recipe, but you didn't really design in the style or the architecture forms. But the HDM practice clearly we saw through different examples tonight was about methodologies and then also the attitudes rather responding to the space and the different context, which makes so unique, endlessly continue to keep very different type of the HDM style, which doesn't have a style, which is kind of very amazing. I think it will be very great learning for the audience, I suppose, today. So unfortunately we have to wrapping up this talk today. Thank you so much. And then also would like to remind, Prada frames continue tomorrow. So day 2, so we will have a seat here. So we have 2 panels, the one in the morning about the sea states, which is more a little bit visual art focused one, and then in the afternoon about the reconceiving material circulation, which Formafantasma also themselves will be on the panel. And then also after this talk, so Prada also generously inviting to the lounge for the reception. So please, if you have a time, please stay for a little drink and have continue the conversation over there. Thank you.
Thank you, Jacques. Thank you.
No questions from the public.
We included